Hi everyone, so in this lecture we're going to cover the skull, which is part of the axial skeleton you see here. So again, your axial skeleton, it runs all the way from your skull up here down to your coccyx over here. So here we have our skull bones, and your skull bones can be classified, or I should say grouped, into two major groups. So the major groups are your cranial bones, and those are the ones that surround and protect that very important organ, that brain inside your head. And then you have your facial bones, and these are the ones that protect the entrances to your body, such as your nose and your mouth. So you want to make sure that if there's any sort of like potential damage with that, so you want to have a solid structure that helps to protect those entrances. Alright, so here are the cranial bones, or actually say here is a cross section of the skull. So what we see is a sagittal section. So if you cut the skull like this and look from the inside, this is what you would see. And as you can see that this is called the cranium, and surrounding the cranium you see this. Why do you have this cranium? Well, it surrounds your brain, and it's very important to have that hard protection around your brain over there. And then over here we see so this is my mnemonic for this. So what are the bones that make up your cranium? Well, there are 6 types of bones and 8 total. So what are the cranial bones? They are, well, this is my mnemonic I like to use. So what will happen if you don't study for your anatomy exams? You will be pissed off. And it just tells you the bones in order. So it's like parietal, ethmoid, sphenoid, temporal, occipital, and frontal. But even though there's 6 listed here, there's actually 2 parietal bones, so left and right, and 2 temporal bones, left and right as well. The rest, there's only 1. Now, articulation, and the thing is that if you ask someone to define the word articulate, they might say, oh, that means well-spoken, that means someone's erudite, that means they're very good at speaking. But articulation is a different term. It has a different definition in anatomy and physiology. So articulation is a joint. That means where 2 bones come in contact to each other and form a bigger structure. So here we have our frontal bone, and what we see is our frontal bone is like in front. So this is your forehead right there. And I know like some textbooks, they say there are 2 frontal bones, but maybe when the babies are developing, their frontal bone actually has that little split in the middle, and that fontanelle, which is membranous tissue. And then as the babies grow and we become adults, this frontal bone becomes 1. But in terms of this class, we are going to say that there's only 1 frontal bone in a fully developed adult. And you can see the frontal bone, it articulates with these 2 bones right here. So you have parietal bones on the left and right, or actually left and right. And then you also have the sphenoid bone, the zygomatic bone, but we'll get to those. So the frontal, pretty easy because up, front, and center. Now the parietal bones, these are on the top of your head, and there's a left and right one. So I like to think of this way. If someone has a splitting headache, what does it feel like? It might feel like someone's trying to pry their head open. And I like to think of that. If you're trying to pry your skull open because to relieve that headache, then you would have the left and right, you would just pull right in the middle of your parietal bones over there. So I like to think of this. If a zombie tries to get at someone's brain, what are they going to do? They're going to try to pry the parietal bones in the center right there. And then you have your temporal bones. So if you rub your temples, where are you rubbing? You're rubbing the side of your head. And just like your parietal bones, there's a left and right. So your left temple and your right temple. And this part right here below the parietal bones, this temporal bones are right there inferior to your parietal bones. And then you have your occipital bones. So the occipital bones are right here. They are in the back of your head. So if you feel your back of your head, and you might feel a little bump as well, that is it's protuberance that's naturally there. But what we have here is like the occipital bone is the back of your skull and protects the back of your brain. Now, to join them all together, you need to form joints. And in the skull, there are special joints called sutures. And what we have are the cranial sutures. So cranial sutures join these big old, and that's the funny thing, they're classified as flat bones. I think when they anatomists talk about flat bones, I think it's more better to call them broad bones, but that's not an official term. But anyway, so then what we have here is that these bones are joined together with these sutures. So here we have the frontal bone joined to the parietal bones with this line right here. So what you would actually have is not just the two bones meshing like this, but also a lot of collagen fibers and proteins that help to keep these two together. And this is what causes those sutures. Well, this is a developing fetal baby skull, and what we see is that it has membrane. It doesn't have these fully fused together bone yet. So eventually when these grow and you have intramembranous ossification, these will start to grow and knit together, and what's left over is that suture you see right here. So with that, so what are these things called anyway? These are called fontanelles, and fontanelles are not bone yet, but they eventually become bone and are replaced by bone. Now, sagittal suture, so what we have as sagittal suture is right down the sagittal plane, so right down the midline. And we can see that the sagittal suture joins the left and right parietal bones down the top of your skull. Now, the sagittal plane, as you can see here, so sagittal straight down the midline, so just like the plane, the suture goes down that midline as well. And then we have our coronal suture. So corona, I know everyone thinks like coronavirus, but coronal suture, what does it refer to? Well, corona actually refers, the Latin term, it means crown. So think of it this way, if you're placing a crown on your head or a tiara, what would it be? It would be like right here, right, on the front. So coronal suture sits on the front, or on the skull, kind of on the top of it and a little toward the front, just like a crown, or assuming your coronation seat, you have the crown right here on the front and it's in the center. So the coronal suture joins, or at least if we're looking at this perspective, the frontal bone is joined to the parietal bones with this coronal suture. Then if we look at the back of the skull, so it's important that, how do you notice the back of the skull? Well, you don't see the eye sockets here, you don't see the orbital complexes. And if you felt that bump in the back of your head, that is this right here. Now, the occipital bone is joined to the parietal bones with something called the lambdoid suture, and it's like, so lambdoid it's not from the animal lamb, but it's actually from the Greek letter. So the Greek letter lambda looks like this. It kind of looks like a little tent, like a little point right here, and that's what it's saying. It's saying like a suture that's shaped like the letter lambda. I know it's kind of like, sometimes it might be out pointy and kind of flat like that, but in this case we see it's more like kind of like a curve right here. Okay, and then you also have something that joins the parietal and temporal bone. Now this one, I mean, to be a little more precise, it doesn't go all the way here. That's a different suture. But most of the parietal and temporal bone is like what joins it together is something called a squamous suture. And this is yet another type of, or another example of when anatomists use the same term to mean different things. So it isn't talking about like the cells themselves, but squamous means scaly. So they think this suture looks scaly on this part, but it only goes from here, this joint right here, and just stops right before you hit the occipital bone. And there's something smaller suture called the parietal mastoid suture. If you're taking my course, I probably won't be that specific, but if you're taking advanced courses or from professors who are more detail oriented, or I should say more about the specifics, then you might want to know this. Alright, so back to those fontanelles. So remember that those fontanelles, they're membranes in developing babies, but they're not quite official. They're not quite made into bone yet. So if you've seen this, like, okay, if you see a baby, and this is also what is sometimes nicknamed the soft spot. And in this soft spot, as you can see, it's kind of indented here. And the thing is that this is actually something that could indicate the health of a baby. If a baby's soft spot is sunken in, that might mean they don't have enough fluid, so the baby might be dehydrated. But on the opposite, say this soft spot is really bulging out, and that might mean there's too much liquid, and that could also be, that means that they could have too much fluids in their brains, and that's something that might need treatment because that could cause brain damage, or it could cause death if it's like something called hydrocephalus. Alright, so then sutures, sometimes they knit together like here, but occasionally the sutures, and if you think of sutures like, and if you're in the clinic, sutures can also mean like sewing something together, like you see this wound right here. But the thing is that sometimes these sutures don't, even though they're complex, sometimes they don't meet right directly like you see here. Sometimes they put these, it's like a kind of like a sneaking river over here, but sometimes there are little islands where you have the suture, But instead of joining together directly, there's an extra bone right here. So the sutures don't quite meet, and there's these open parts right here, but something needs to fill in the gap. You still need a closed skull. So that's what we call sutural bones or Wormian bones, and not everybody has this. And you probably, and unless you get actually an X-ray or some sort of imaging of your skull, you can go your entire life without knowing you have these extra bones in your skull. Now with that, or Wormian, I like to think of this as well. So they're also called Wormian bones. I like to think these are bones that have like these squiggly Wormian worm kind of like structure around them. All right, so then, yeah, here's another example of like a suture. So it's not just in that lambdoid suture. You can have it here. Like here's another extra bone right here, and here's another Wormian bone over here. And those are the cranial bones. So we have the frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and the ethmoid and sphenoid. So the ethmoid bone, you can't see it from the surface right here, but actually you can see it partially from the surface here, but not all of it. So the ethmoid bone, you can see it peeking through the eye sockets over here and through the nasal cavity over here. So the ethmoid bone, if you just took it by itself and you looked at the top of it, you would see all these little holes in this lacy-like structure. And what these are this is what is called the cribriform plate. So I was thinking whenever, sometimes cribriform, whenever they're using anatomy, it's saying it's something like it has a lot of holes, it's kind of like a sponge, it's very lacy. And this is actually where your nerve endings that lead to your sense of, or detect your sense of smell, they actually go through this, like, because they go from your brain, or actually they go from your nasal cavity and from your nose, and this sends these little signals up into your brain through these little holes right here. And then over here, what we see is like, okay, yep, so here we see this olfactory nerve fibers. So when you smell something, these little particles end up in your nasal cavity right here. And these nerve endings, they detect whatever chemicals there are. And then this sends it up to the olfactory nerve, and this goes to your brain, leading to your sense of smell. Now, we're looking at the back of this, the ethmoid bone. Still the same bone, but now we turned it from here, and now we're looking at it from, say, the back of the skull. And what you see is something called a perpendicular plate, and this helps to form like the parts are what the thing about your nasal cavity is that it's divided into left and right one. So this helps form part of that border right there. That border is called a septum. Okay, so then I look at this one, you're like, oh man, well, how do you detect, or how do you know which one and identify which one is the ethmoid? And I just think, okay, the ethmoid is one of those that, compared to all the other ones, those are really smooth looking from the outside, right? But notice that ethmoid, it's very lacy. It kind of looks like it's, I mean, even though it's actually kind of smooth, but it looks kind of very porous and open and complex. And another way, if you're looking at this perspective from the back, turn it 90 degrees, and it looks like a rough approximation of an E. At least that's how I know it. And this middle part of the E would be the perpendicular plate, and these would be the left and right. Now then there's something called a sphenoid bone, and you can't see part of it from the outside of the skull. It's this part right here. As you see, it's situated between the frontal, parietal, and temporal bones over there. Now with this, if you look from the front, and if you just took the sphenoid by itself and looked from the front, you would see it would look like this. And notice that even though this part looks rough, it only looks rough because that's where you join it to the other bones. So just because again, they're going to look like this if you see these bones fused together, or joined together, but when you take them apart, they kind of have those little projections and indentations. But back to this. So this orbital surface, what fits in here? Well, your big, soft, squishy, round, smooth eyeballs. So if this wasn't smooth right here, then your eyeballs would not have a good time moving around in a very rough surface. It would be like sandpaper. So it makes sense that this orbital surface where your eyeballs would be, or like touching, or I should say next to your eyeballs, would be smooth. Now I like to think from this perspective, it kind of looks like a butterfly. I know, very approximate. I like to think, okay, these are the antenna, these are like the eyes, and these are, but even the anatomists agree, like they call these the wings right here with this, in terms of like the structures of the sphenoid bone. Now, if you look from what we see here is that we're looking from the top of it. So if you cut open the skull like this and looked at the sphenoid from the top and took it out by itself, you would see that it kind of looks like this structure, and it still has the wings. So I like to think this kind of looks like a bat with these wings out like there. So again, they do call these the greater wings you see over there. There's also lesser wings as well. So a lot of anatomy, we like to think, okay, this does look like a winged sort of like bone. Okay, so mnemonic time. So here is, say you're in trouble, and then what do they send out if you're in Gotham City and someone's in trouble? They send out the bat signal. But wait, this isn't the bat signal, it's a sphenoid signal. So I like to think of it this way. So here's the sphenoid bone, and there's a very important structure right here that contains a very important gland. So this structure is an indentation called the sella turcica. And sella turcica is a Latin term that means Turkish saddle. And I'm like, okay, what's a Turkish saddle? So it's something that looks like this. And I'm like, okay, thanks. Like, everyone knows what a Turkish saddle is, but whatever. So the sella turcica, it is like, well, what do you use a saddle for? A saddle is where someone sits on. And what sits in the sella turcica is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a very important gland for your endocrine system. And so this pituitary gland sits right here in the sella turcica. So just like my little mnemonic right there, you have Batman. What does Batman do? Batman sits in the Batmobile, just like your sella turcica sits in the wing bone called, or I should say, Batman. Here are the Batwing, and Batman sits in the Batwing. And then what does your pituitary do? Well, your pituitary sits in the wing bone. It sits in the wing sphenoid in the sella turcica you see right here.